Let's go.
Let's go.
All right, boys. Welcome to the Dancing for Architecture podcast, where we podcast and stuff.
Yes,
like
sir.
you do if you're on a podcast.
Maybe.
Yes, but today I'm super excited for today's episode. Despite the technical difficulties that we've had trying to get an episode up for this week, this is like the quickest turnaround from recording to putting out that we've had. But this week, we are talking about The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance, one of my favorite albums of all time.
Yeah, it's a really, really good album. And I'm gonna admit, like, the first time I listened to it, I was just like sitting there like, what is happening? But that second time around, like, sheesh.
It gets so much better on second listen. I had a similar reaction because one of my friends in high school told me to listen to it, and I listened to it like my junior year of high school, and I just kind of listened to it, and I was just like, eh. But then I went back and listened to it again after I had moved out, and I was just like, yo, this album is incredible.
Yeah, that second time around was it just hit different, especially when you look into like the narrative. It's insane.
Oh yeah, man. Oh yeah. But before we get into that, let's start by plugging our link of the day. Now, this link of the day has a lot of thematic elements tied to the album that we're talking about. It deals a lot with existentialism and the meaning of life and what life really is.
Yeah. It definitely covers the frustration that can come from trying to define, existence.
Yeah, man, it's a good video. I can't play this straight. I cannot. I tried my hardest. But go watch the link of the day.
Just
go watch
it.
the link. Just freaking watch it. But before we get into like the first track of the album, let's talk about the album as a whole. What did you like about the album, like as a whole?
So, immediate standout, like even before I did the second listen, immediate standout are the inflections in Gerard's voice, like his like, I don't know how to describe it, like the way he words things, it's just so like different. Like it caught me off guard at first, but like that hour, but it like adds flavor,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, definitely that. Definitely that's the birth of, I guess, the emo, like punk rock kind of like emo nostalgic. Like that whole genre of music is based around that sort of vocal inflection where it's almost like you're trying to make everything seem like the biggest deal in the world, regardless of how big of a deal it is.
Right.
So, that is definitely a really good catch. I think for me, on the first listen, I'm just like, okay, like this is just some solid punk rock. And then on each successive listen, I started to notice more things. Like the second listen, I was like, okay, there's some actually really cool narrative stuff going on. And then I started to notice like, okay, like this isn't just a punk rock album. It's got all of these instrumentations going on. They're just way totally outside of the genre's usual like flavor, where it's like I went back and listened to My Chemical Romance's first two albums, not in preparation for the podcast, but this was a while back. And the instrumentation on this album is miles ahead of the typical four or five piece rock, punk rock outfit that's guitar, bass, lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass, drums.
Right.
It's you've got all of these like horns going on in certain spots. You got the piano, and in one song you get like this total like cabaret style stuff going on. I'm super excited to talk about that track, but we'll save that for there. But overall, I think the thing that really stuck out to me the most on this last listen through was the way that this album is so tightly knit together narratively. Like, initially I was just like, this is a super loose narrative. There's not much you can pick up as far as a story goes. But then, like, I started noticing, like, different tracks connecting way more than I had initially thought they did.
Yeah, there are several references in different tracks to other tracks and just themes. They're very continuous. But like, yo, this John, when you find out what it's about and just the heartbreaking lyrics on some of these. Like it's so depressing, but like it's also very hopeful in some areas as well.
Yeah, for sure. So to kind of since this is more of a concept album than anything else we've previously covered, I think we should kind of go over the loose narrative of the record before we start the recording or like start talking about every individual track. So this kind of follows the last days of a cancer patient throughout him dealing with his relationships, his insecurities, his existential crises, all that stuff. You just kind of see him dealing with these things and really just reflecting on life. And it's really, when you start listening to the real lyrics, it's, as Malachi said, really heartbreaking.
Yeah, and even this guy, the patient, we see him go through so many different phases of approaching this death. Like we see him. We're gonna get into it, but it's just there's
We're
so
going to get
much.
into it.
There's
Yeah.
so much that he goes through.
Yeah. So let's start with the first track, "The End." I that was one of the first things that stood out to me when I first looked at this album is the fact that it starts with the end. I was just like, that's kind of weird. Like, why would they put the end at the beginning? But then, like, listening through it, I'm just like, okay, like, it sets the stage super well. Like, it's got, again, going back to the different instrumentation where you got these pianos, this acoustic guitar, super theatrical opening where you just kind of get this top down view of the situation, but at the same time, you get some perspectives of the patient and just overall seeing this spot where you get him getting his diagnosis, and then that leads into the next track, which we'll get into in a second. Unless you had anything else you wanted to add to this one. This one's not sort of,
No,
I don't know, like this is just an opener.
I was just gonna say, I like how he starts it with like "come one, come all," like like he's gathering around to tell a story, like an old type folk story. But yeah, I also
Yeah,
like how it starts with like a beep, like you're just in a
hmm
hospital. But that's pretty much it.
yeah, no. When you mentioned that, I had to think about like one of the lyrics that I've always found very interesting is "gather round piggies and kiss this goodbye. I encourage your smiles. I expect you won't cry." That line always stuck out to me where it's just like you're like, okay, like this is the narrator is either being extremely facetious or puts no value on this patient's life, which could be a reflection of the patient's view of his own life, which I think is a really cool way to start the album.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's get into Dead. This was my favorite track on the album for a long time. Not anymore, but a solid like, I don't know, like you have like the end being like the prelude, I suppose, and this just feels like the true opening track, the explosion to kick everything off. What a banger.
A
What an
solid hook.
absolute
A
banger.
solid hook to get this album going. Not gonna lie.
Yeah. This one dives into the narrative. I've literally just been winging it. I haven't been reading my notes. I did preparation and didn't read my notes. Okay, now I am reading my notes. Now we are back on track. Cool, 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 cool. So it continues the sort of narrative elements that you had going on from the end, and it kicks off this character's dealing with his self-worth and if he matters and like what are people going to think about him when he's gone, are people going to think about him when he's gone, like you just kind of get all of this stuff is just kicking off in this song and this just kind of glorious explosion of emo rock, which just chef's kiss.
Yeah.
Also the guitar solo at the end
Oh
is
yeah, I
really
was just
nice.
about to say that the soloing in general on this whole thing, like even on teenagers, but we'll talk about teenagers, but the perspective on this song, we kind of switch from the patient to the doctor to the patient's mother. Like I think every verse, it's like you're switching perspectives, so it's like super interesting.
Yeah, no, 100% for sure. But before we move on to Dead, I want to kind of, or This Is How I Disappear. I want to talk about the guitar solo a little bit more. I
Okay.
just love the way that it's these doubled guitar solos on this track specifically. It's really cool the way that you just have these two guitars having a conversation with each other, where you have moments where they're talking over each other. You have these moments where they're in agreement about things. You have these moments where one's in response to another, and like all of this stuff where it's just like I feel like this is like could literally just be like discussion after you get your like cancer diagnosis, where it's just like all of these emotions flaring up. And I mean, you could say, yeah, it's just a guitar solo on a rock track, so what? But I think that that's really cool. That kind of the way that the two guitars talk to each other, and it
That's
sounds freaking amazing.
yeah, that's an interesting take. I didn't think of it as like um a conversation, but oh, it also does that on Dark Side of the Moon, like where they have the two guitar solos panning back and forth. So that was a little thing that I
Yeah.
noticed, but yeah.
Shout outs to every time we mention Pink Floyd in this podcast. I low key feel like we mention Pink Floyd so much, more than any other artist.
Honestly, I
Like
think every episode.
so basically we're a Pink Floyd podcast now.
Honestly.
We're not allowed to talk about any album without tying it back to Pink Floyd. Speaking of Pink Floyd, this
Oh
album
yeah,
feels heavily
The
inspired
Wall.
by The Wall. Yeah, like if you take a look at The Wall and the way that it was did kind of the shiftings of perspectives and narration and the kind of sort of open-ended way that it ends, like you can draw a lot of comparisons and it's very clear that Gerard took heavy inspiration from that from that record, and I think that that's really cool. Like I just really like rock opera. I really like rock operas, and this one is really freaking good. So Pink Floyd rant over. Let's get back to My Chemical Romance, the band that we're actually talking about.
Yes, sir. All right, this is how I disappear. Um, so another solid hook. Not gonna lie, they kind of come with the bangers, but yeah, he's talking to someone he really cares about, and it's just like I'm dipping out, you know.
Yeah, this one's a really interesting track. So like in my brain, when I kind of listen through this record, I kind of sort it into a few different sections, and I feel like with Kind of Dead, this track and the next track are kind of like, I guess, the singles, the radio friendly tracks, they're just kind of like safe emo punk. Like these are just the most stereotypical MCR songs you could write. Um, and so I think that that's like interesting because like when you get like these two tracks I kind of find boring in comparison to the rest of the record. Like on this listen through, I got a lot more of the narrative that you need to that you can grasp from these couple tracks. But overall, like in my brain, I'm just like, okay, but get to the good part. Where good part? Where Welcome to the Black Parade? Yeah, so that's kind of like I'm just like kind of waiting for it to do all the super duper experimental instrumentation and the really heavy narrative stuff where it just really ties together as an album. But yeah, this is just a solid track as a whole.
Yeah, I didn't have too many notes for this.
Yeah. The one note that I did want to talk about, like narratively, is this one is the track that talks the most heavily about being remembered, and the line "without you is how I disappear," with this idea of like, listen, like I feel like you're my only tie to being remembered when I die,
Mm.
and just kind of him wrestling with these insecurities of like, was my life even worth living? Like, does my life have implications on the rest of the world, you know? Like dealing with that kind of existentialism that you'd often find yourself thinking about if you were like, okay, I have cancer and I probably have a very short time to live. And
Yeah.
so the narrative on this is just really heartbreaking. So that's pretty much what I had for this one.
Yeah, that's a common theme too in this album of like the memory that people carry of you is what will help you to carry on, which is and welcome to the Black Parade. But
He said the name of the album.
the Black
He
Parade.
said he said a line from the title track of the album.
Yes, sir.
Yes, and this the Sharpest Lives. This is another one that really warmed up to me the more that I listened to it. Um Specifically the line "Give me a shot to remember." I love that line so much because there's so many different ways you can take it. You can take it as a sort of antithesis to I'm gonna take a shot to forget. You can take it as, can you give me a shot to be remembered? Like, can you give me a chance to be remembered? Like, there's just so many. It's just such a good sentence
Yo.
where it's just like, I'm just like, oh shoot, there's so much baked into this, and there's so much emotional impact where it's like, he's not drinking to forget. He's drinking to remember. He's like, I want to relive my life and like mull over that, and that's what this album is a lot of, is him mulling over his life.
Yeah,
But
that's interesting because like
there's just so much in that line. I
it
love it.
seems like an oxymoron if you think about it. Like, oh, give me a shot to remember, you know, but it's also like
Hmm.
give me a shot, you know.
Yeah, and so I really like that line specifically. Not much else from the track really stands out to me. It's, again, like, it's a standard MCR song. Like, it's a good song. It's a banger. Every track on this
Give
album's
me
a
a shot
banger.
to remember. Yes, sir. And I
Freaking
also I like at the beginning where he has like the panning whispers, just like you know.
yeah,
That was just a small touch. Classic punk thing to do.
yeah. It's really, the vocals on this track are good, great. But let's get
Bro,
to
we gotta hit
the
the
title
song.
track. The title track of the album, kind of. Welcome to the Black Parade. This is the song that everybody thinks about when they think about this album. This is the song that has probably the most fleshed out, like, I don't know, like, it has like the most fleshed out sort of ethereal metaphysical themes going on, where he's talking about death in the sense of death coming for you in the form of a parade, which I've always found to be really interesting, where it's like, some people think of death as like the Grim Reaper pulling up, grabbing your soul, but he's just like, no, there's a parade that comes that's like a celebration of your life,
Mm.
kind of type thing. And I just, that image is so cool. It's just so unique. I've never really heard an image of death that really stood up to that, you know?
Mm.
Like, it's just freaking dope. But it has the most iconic note of any song ever that I have heard. No other song can you say, can you just play a G on the piano and people are like, "Oh my gosh, are you playing that My Chemical Romance song?"
Oh, the dung 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 dung. The beginning.
Yeah. Like, it's a frequent meme, like back when I used to frequent like the emo Google Plus circles,
Oh my gosh.
like back in middle school.
Good old Google Plus.
Shoutouts to Google Plus, man. It was a theme of like, people, here's the G. It's like, I'm not emo anymore. Also me when I hear the G note from the Black Parade, and then it's just like them going full back into their emo like makeup and stuff. And it's just a hilarious picture. It's like, I'm not emo. Da! Oh shoot, I'm emo.
Yeah, and even this track, like I mentioned earlier, how on my first listen it was just like but this track stood out on my first listen, so that says something. Like I was just bumping in my living room, I was like, oh shoot, we'll carry on. Yeah, it
Yeah,
just hits.
this track is so good. I love, without getting too far out into like the geekiness and like just being like, oh my gosh, it's so good. Uh, to like actual things, tangible things we can look at. I love the sonic imagery they use here, where you have that like marching drum, you have the bells, you have all of these different things where it just feels like you can hear that parade coming towards you, and it's just really good.
Yeah,
I,
I like the touch of having like the marching band snares just you know.
yeah, I love that. And then lyrically, this is really cool because this is the first note of hope that we really get on this record, where you get this idea of him, the narrator, saying to the main character, like, listen, your memory is going to carry on. You may think you're going to be forgotten, but you're significant enough that your memory is going to carry on. And I think that that's a really cool contrast between this and the previous two tracks.
Mm.
It's so cool, and like, I like this idea where it's like, in the end it's just kind of this defiant chorus where it's just like, no, just because I'm dying doesn't mean that's what I'm going to let define the way that I finish my life or the way that I'm remembered, you know? And I think that that's like another really awesome perspective that he has here, where it's just like, even though I'm like dying or whatever, like, I mean, I say that as in like dying is just kind of an
Dying
everyday
or
thing for
whatever.
most people. Like, it's like dying or whatever. Even though I'm dying, like, this doesn't have to define the way that I view the rest of my life or other people view the rest of my life. And I think that's really, really cool and really, really profound.
Yeah, and just to like close off this track, I want to highlight a Gerard Way quote. He said, I'd like to think that when you die, death comes for you however you want. And I feel that it's your strongest memory, either from childhood or adulthood. And so what he was going for with this song is like, oh, when I was a young boy, like my dad took me to a parade, and so when he's dying, his fondest memory is what his death manifests into. Like, so if it's like, oh, your fondest memory is I walked in by the lake or something, I don't know, then you just die and you just see a lake or something. But
Yeah,
that's interesting to me, that
that's very
interpretation.
interesting. Um, and I think that this track kind of kicks off the more, like, I think this is the track where you really feel the idea of death set in on this record, where the tracks before kind of beat around the bush and talk about disappearing and being remembered, but this one is just like, okay, you have death right out there in front. And then you get to the next track, I Don't Love You, which deals with death in the sense of a relationship and how much of a strain this can put on the other person. And he's like always questioning, like, are you going to say I don't love you like I did before when we didn't have to deal with all this crap? Like, when are you going to say that? Almost like he's begging her to say that.
Yeah, that
And
was interesting to me. Like he was saying, oh, like kind of begging her to say that they weren't the same as before. And I kind of took it as maybe he wants her to move on so that she doesn't like so that he gets closure maybe. Like that was a very interesting concept in this.
yeah, definitely the line, would you have the guts to say?
Right.
Like, it's very much a goading you on, like, come on, say it. I know you got the guts in there somewhere. And it's just really heartbreaking because it's just like someone, half of it feels like he's begging her to not, like, leave him, and half of it feels like he's begging her to just move on with her life. And it's just like this kind of like these conflicting views, and like we have several tracks that kind of continue to follow this specific storyline. Also in the guitar solo, there's a part of the guitar solo where he does a lick that reminds me of the guitar solo on Bohemian Rhapsody,
Mm.
so much to the point where I can't help but think it's a tribute to that song. Do you know the lick I'm talking about?
No,
The
but they're oh wow, that was in there?
yeah, it's something that sounds very close to that part of Bohemian Rhapsody. And every time I hear that, I'm just like, yo, guitar solo from Bohemian Rhapsody, right here.
But like,
Um,
there are definitely a lot of rock opera like tributes in this. Like, I see a whole bunch of Queen just all over this album.
mhm. Yeah, 100%. Like, in a lot of the instrumentation, the dramatic instruments they choose, and like this just kind of over the top vocal performances, all of that. Yeah, freaking great, man. This track is good. This track is sad.
Yeah,
And then we
definitely
get in.
unprecedented for punk.
Yeah, and then we get into this
House of
next
Wolves.
track, House of Wolves. This is the biggest, like, I feel like this is the track on the record that's supposed to, like, just sonically shock you into the idea of death. Where it's like, you get these very fiery guitars, this kind of, this very, very, very vivid imagery of hell just from the instrumentation. And that is so cool because this is the first track that deals with the idea of what the afterlife is, and him talking about, oh, I don't, please tell me that I'm an angel, or like tell me that I'm going to heaven, but then he turns around and says, like, tell me I'm a terrible person and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to heaven, I'm going to hell. Like, it's crazy. These just kind of, this kind of like swinging back and forth of like what he wants, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely a huge just like, yo, what? And even later, on what was it? On Mama, where he just goes in on the just this idea of hell. But like this introduction, I kind of envision like a jazz club, but
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
but like I don't know if you know like that old style animation like the for Cuphead or something.
Yeah, no, that's the same thing. Like when I watched a video talking about this album and they mentioned Jazz Club, I immediately thought Cuphead. I didn't think I didn't think like a literal jazz club. I thought like the Deal with the Devil kind of like Cuphead soundtrack type beat. That's exactly what I thought.
Yeah, that just came straight to mind. It's all fast paced. I'm like, yo, I'm losing to a boss terribly. But yeah.
F's in the chat. Shoutouts to Malachi losing to the boss terribly in Cuphead. F's in the chat for
Never
our
beat the
boy.
game. Let's go.
Let's go. Yeah, so this is like a track that just feels like super duper angry and desperate and like really frustrated. And then after this we get Cancer, and honestly these next four tracks I feel like the order kind of confused me a good amount upon first listen, but when I got to thinking about it, it made more sense because I was just like, oh, I feel like Cancer should be immediately after I Don't Love You because these two really mesh well thematically. They mesh well musically. It could just be kind of a lull in the album. But I feel like the order that we have of these four, where it's I Don't Love You, House of Wolves, Cancer, Mama, that order specifically, what it really accomplishes is you understanding just kind of the roller coaster of emotions that he's going through, where he's just jumping from dealing with love life to dealing with death and what happens after death and all of that stuff. And also, like, I feel like Cancer is a much more powerful track after House of Wolves. Whereas, like, if it's right after I Don't Love You, it's like, okay, it feels like we got our answer to the question immediately. But since it's like after House of Wolves, you have him just like dealing with this imagery, right? And then he doesn't say the hardest part of this is the fear of what comes when I die. The hardest part of this is leaving you. And I
Mm.
think that's a lot more powerful coming after House of Wolves than it would have been coming after I Don't Love You.
Yeah, and this track is just super blunt. It doesn't have a lot of symbolism in it. It's just like I lost my hair, I'm dying, my like it's super direct. He's planning his funeral. There's not a lot of like, oh, this means this. It's like literally I'm dying. And you can see that even with the stripped down vibe, just like the piano and the vocals, and it's supposed to be super intimate, so
Yeah, it's definitely the most raw track, and it's the most straightforward track of like what's going on the record. A lot of the other ones are just kind of like over the top metaphor layered into metaphor where you have to dig through a bunch of things to figure out what he's actually talking about. This one is just like, yeah, I'm friggin' dying and I have to deal with that. So, yeah, no, it's a heartbreaking track here. But let's get into the next track. This is my personal favorite on the record.
bro,
Mama.
when they came out with like the ska vibe, I'm like, yo, what?
Yeah, no, the cabaret, man, like the freaking like I'm just like, okay, like I feel like I am a high society person listening to this track in some random theatre somewhere.
Yeah, tra.
And it's the instrumentation on this thing is just brilliant across the board. I love the way that it follows up the themes from House of Wolves, where it's just talking about the idea of like where before he's like trying to be like, okay, like do I feel like I go to heaven? Do I feel like I go to hell? Like where am I lying on this? And then he just kind of throws that all to the side and he's like, everyone goes to hell. There's no heaven to go to. And I'm just like, dang,
Yeah, I can't tell
what a
if it's
perspective.
I can't tell if it's like out of spite. It's just like he recognizes how terrible his life was or whatever. But like, yeah, it's super. It's one of the most emo things that I've ever heard. Um, and I just want to highlight like during the post chorus, you get like this Mike Wazowski vocal, and you're right.
The I should have been a better son thing.
Yeah, I should have. I'm like, yo, that's hilarious.
You call my man Mike Wazowski.
Mike Wazowski.
Yeah, this track, like, I love the build across this whole thing where you get the first verse that's just super like there's not a lot going on, it's mostly guitar, and then you get the build into the chorus, and the chorus is just like your typical like emo rock, but then you get back into the verse and you still have these theatrical things and you get the Mike Wazowski voice. Gosh darn it.
That's all you're gonna. That's all you're gonna hear every time you.
No, I don't. No, no.
Mike
Heck, dude.
Wazowski.
My gosh. But then after that, you get back into the chorus. But then I love this like build up to the drop where you just kind of get this vamping after the chorus, where you get these like really dissonant guitar notes and then just kind of run down in these screams, and then it just everything drops out. And then did you happen to take down the name of the singer that they sampled here, or like had feature here?
I
Because I've heard her
didn't.
name before. I just
It starts
forgot.
with an L, I think.
I think it's like a Liz something.
Liz something.
Mm.
Yeah. Some
Liza?
Italian,
No, it's Liza something.
some Italian last name, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, but like when she hits you with the "and if you would call me your sweetheart, I'd maybe then sing you a song," and then it just bursts into this like absolute rage of like, I've done terrible things. I was a terrible son. I am not worthy of any form of sympathy, and the next track gets into that even more, where there's just this explosion of anger coming out, where there's things that I've done with this terrible gun. That's not what he says, but I'm definitely not repeating what he says. This is a PG podcast. Um, but then he gets that, and then he talks about we all carry on when our brothers in arms are gone. Going back to that memory theme. So raise your glass high, for tomorrow we die. And just like this kind of like, at this point, he's just like challenging death, like, yeah, come at me, bro.
Right, and it kind of feels like a soldier's death almost. Like it's like all your brothers and that are fighting, you're just all gonna die. You know it, so you're just like,
Yeah,
they're gonna drink and just die.
yeah. And I almost wonder if this just kind of like, if the patient here was a soldier at some point, and like this is him dealing with some of that PTSD.
Mm.
Because he talks about, I think there's another track after this that talks about him being a soldier or him doing terrible things, or just kind of like the way he's been screwed up in the head by some sort of violence. Teenagers definitely talks about that. Sleep talks about it a little bit, but like I almost wonder if he's just like going through this like, why did I have to kill? Like if I was a soldier, like if he was a soldier, he might have been just wrestling with that like, why did I have to kill? Why was I this terrible of a person? But I think that this is a great way to transition into Sleep. Another heartbreaking track.
I
This
know.
album's just sad. This album's just really sad. Shoutouts to the Big Sad.
Yeah, it's just like painfully sad. Like some background on this actually is they recorded this album in a haunted mansion. So like they stayed there and everything. And so Gerard had like frequent night terrors. Like he would wake up and just start convulsing and just like not be able to breathe, or like some craziness. And that's kind of what you see in the skits, like at the beginning and
Mm-hmm.
end, where it's talking about like, oh, I couldn't breathe, da 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 da, and it's like cutting off. That was
Yeah, it
an
feels like something's
actual.
gripping my throat. Yeah, all that stuff. That's
I,
crazy,
it
bro.
actually happened to him. I'm like, did they really have to go that like? Are they purists? Did they have to record it in a haunted? I'm like, yo,
Artists are wild, man. Like I think of
why?
all of the different jokers who aggressively got into their parts, and I think of like how mentally taxing that was for to play that specific role. Shout outs to Batman. But yeah, no, definitely with this track, like he talks about this idea of again him being a terrible person, him coming to the conclusion that he's not sorry. How could you ever have any sympathy for him because he's a terrible person and he doesn't even feel sorry for it? Like all of this kind of like self-deprecation in this track is just crazy. And then you just kind of like get this narrative of like, why do you still love me? Like what makes you stick around? I've been a terrible person in life. I'm a burden in death. Like,
Mm.
why are you still around? You know? So, really, really carries a lot of the themes from Cancer and Mama and ties them together beautifully.
Yeah, yeah. But
But
teenagers. Uh
whoo,
so this track,
sheesh.
this and Welcome to the Black Parade are songs that I've actually heard before, like people have put me onto. I think you did actually.
Yeah, I probably put you onto this track. This is definitely the certified thick groove of this album.
Yeah, this one
This
just
song is
like it
this
hits.
song slaps, bro.
Yeah, but it kind of just like describes an irrational, well, semi-rational fear of teens.
Hmm.
It's just like, yo, I was a teen. I knew I was doing dumb stuff, and now I'm grown up, and I'm just like, dang, I'm afraid of y'all.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of subtext here talking about like I don't feel like he's even talking about like actual literal teenagers. I think he's talking about the way that he was institutionalized and how he had this rough teenager time of his life where he felt like you have these verses talking about how the schools and the adults of the world just didn't trust you at all because you have like this idea of like yeah they're sleeping with a gun and keeping an eye on you just so that make sure you don't do anything whack, and then you have the second verse where he's talking about yeah other teenagers were jerks to me as well, so like it was a freaking terrible time, and you just get all of this beautiful subtext of him just kind of reflecting on how he got to where he was in his life. And that's why this 3 track stretch from Mama to Teenagers is my favorite stretch on the album, because you get him reflecting on how his relationship with his mother and how he felt like he was a terrible son, or maybe how that was put upon him by his mother. And then you have Sleep where he's talking about he's just kind of done terrible things, and you have Teenagers where he's just like okay, like how did I get to this point, and then talking about the way that high school screwed him up. And
Right.
it's just so good. Like, and also just the lyrics are so cleverly written sonically. Like you get all of these quick rhymes where it's just you're gonna clean up your looks with all the lies in the books to make a citizen out of you. Like all of these lyrics just are so pleasing and so cleverly
They
written.
roll off the tongue, yeah.
They roll off the tongue so well. That's why this song is just like a perfect, like it's very functional within the sub within the structure that is the album, but everything else about it is the perfect making of a hit song. And I that's why I love this. It's just such a cleverly written song.
Yeah, and it's like thematically, you're just like, wait, what does that have to do with death? But like if you think about it, he I mean, he's still reflecting on his life, so it fits in the narrative. But like it's just a banger, you know?
Just a whole banger.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
no,
and that solo. I forgot to mention solo. That gave me some like classic rock vibes. I don't know why, but that solo.
yeah, it's literally just the 1 4 5 chord progression that classic rock kind of took and made its own, that made this song work. Got these kind of bluesy vibes. And then the solo is really cool. I really enjoyed the solo. I still think the solo on Dead I like more, but it's a good solo. And the chorus, so catchy. I find myself like this is the chorus I find myself screaming running around the house at like 2 in the afternoon a lot of the times, because it's just so freaking good, man. I mean, I could talk for hours about a lot of this album. Like I could have talked for way longer about Mama than we did. Like that track has so much depth. But yeah, no, Teenagers, banger track. And then you get into this way more slowed down, very just kind of like chill in the vibes and just kind of like emotional, reflective track that is Disenchanted.
Yeah, we get like this guitar ballad that's just another depressing song. Like he's just reflecting on how disappointing this thing we call life is. Like what even was it? Like I just look back and why.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that sticks out to me the most is the fact that he continually points out to the fact that his heroes sold out, and
Right.
like how this character I think is canonically a musician, um and like he's like okay, like I see my heroes who inspired me, they sold out and they're selling cars on TV now. Like, and then you hear him talking about the fact of like what makes him sing and like the disappointment that he feels in his heroes because the passion that he felt for music, he feels like he can look at them and say, "Oh, they didn't feel the same. They didn't feel the same passion. Like I suffered as a fan of them through high school, was pushed around for that. Um, and now I just get to watch them sell cars on TV. Like you're really disappointed me, man. Like
Yeah.
it's just so sad."
It's sad because like it brings that concept of life being meaningless, but it's also like, oh, even the best of the best seem to not get this life thing right. So it just adds to the layers of like, dang.
Yeah. This track is just a big sad.
Oh, one thing I want to highlight, two things.
Mhm.
So on the hook where it's like never done nothing to ya, like that always hits me every time for no reason. Like those fourths,
Mhm.
that harmony there, I don't know, that just it makes me feel good. Um,
Yeah.
but
This
this
this is definitely like this is definitely the lull before the big finish of the album.
the
Famous last
lull.
words.
Yeah, but oh,
Lull
another
as in Lull, not as in
oh,
LOL.
no, I was about to say it's definitely not a lull.
This track got me raffle,
What?
rolling on the floor laughing.
Oh my
Raffle.
gosh, what in the
This
world?
track got me raffle, boys.
But like, yeah,
Uh,
another lyric I want to highlight is where it says, "You're just a sad song with nothing to say about a lifelong wait for a hospital stay." So I'm just like, dang, like you're just waiting your whole life for a hospital stay, which is kind of whack.
yeah, it's just like, yeah, like you came out, you were born in a hospital, and you're just kind of walking around until you have to go back and freaking die. Like that's depressing. That's so depressing. Holy crap, this album's depressing.
For
I think we
real.
should call this episode The Big Sad.
Honestly, that's what I get. Like when I finished, after Blood, I was just like sitting there for a good 5 minutes, like, uh.
Yeah, but let's get to famous last words. The other, like, I feel like there's two intensely positive tracks on this record, and that's Welcome to the Black Parade and this track. And I think that this is a fabulous way to close out the record because of its hopeful notes, the way that it ties everything together, and just overall like the instrumentation as well. Like on the bridge, you get these like crashing drums that just scream album closer, and it's just like this super theatrical finish. And despite everything, the way that it ties everything up neatly in a bow, it still leaves the ending very ambiguous. Like, does the dude die? Does the dude stay alive? Like, what is it? And the really cool part is when you realize that it doesn't matter. That what matters is the way that he was able to make peace with everything that was going on in his life, and he was able to make peace with his life. And so if he lives on, he gets to continue to live on and live in that peace. But if he dies, he died at peace. So like I think that it's really cool where it's like this open-ended thing where you can think, "Oh, does he live? Does he die? Is it important?" No, it's really not. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was a big thing. I was like, what happened? Like we get all this build up and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to continue living." I'm like, "Is that a metaphor or are you actually like living?" So, yeah.
Yeah. A line that I really wanted to point out was "Honey, if you stay, you'll be forgiven," where very clearly in dealing with this cancer, he and his significant other, like they had to wrestle through so much relational stuff. And at this point, he's just like, I'm not afraid. Like, what he literally says is, I'm not afraid to keep living. And like, he's not afraid to stay alive. But like, he's also with this, like, where it's like, even if I die, you're going to be forgiven if you just stay with me through this, where it's like you take the ideas from I Don't Love You where he's kind of begging her to go, and then you get the stuff on this track where he's just like, I am begging you to stay,
Mm.
you know. And I think that that's a really cool thing where it closes that out really well. It answers the question that we had on that first track of this sort of storyline.
Yeah, and even to touch on just the videos for this whole album, like the video for this is just like fire everywhere and Fun fact, like every single bandmate got injured during the filming of it.
Nothing screams emo like every bandmate getting injured.
Yeah, it was just fire everywhere and just like burning guitars and just insane.
Yeah,
But
this whole album is insane. Like this is the defining rock opera of a generation. Like I think some people will point to American Idiot, but I think that this one was a little bit more important than that one because whereas American Idiot was like dealing with political themes like I can't really relate to a lot of the stuff they were talking about on American Idiot because it's a completely different political climate now. But when I sit down and listen to this album and the themes of death and the themes of love and the themes of just like everything is so inherently human about this record and like it clearly shows because you have all of these acts that followed in the footsteps of My Chemical Romance in just in the way that they had like the way that they constructed this absolutely perfect rock opera where everyone can sit down and listen to it and relate to it to some degree and it's just like for a lot of people it was like the soundtrack of like their high school. I'm a little too young for that. This album came out when I was 5. um so this album for me it was actually the soundtrack of when I moved out of high school and moved out on my own, and there was just like a time period where I was just like listening to this album nonstop, and I can totally understand why people would say people are blinded by nostalgia for this record because there's a large amount of people who are just like who were like in middle school or high school when they listen to this. But then like I look at it and I'm like, I don't think it's nostalgia. I think it's just a banger album that everyone can relate to.
yeah, I mean, I never heard this album before this week, except for like two songs, and like I'm bopping, bro. So like I don't know. Sometimes nostalgia carries, but sometimes it's just like, yo, that was actually good, and I was onto something back then.
Yeah. This album is like in my opinion, this is probably the last great rock opera. I haven't heard any good rock operas that have come out since this record has come out. Like, if anyone knows any and wants to put them in the comments and correct me for my ignorance, go ahead. But I can't think of any rock operas that come even close to the monumental, just overall ness of this album. Um, so I think that that closes out Famous Last Words. Let's get on to the bonus track. I love this track. Blood is so good.
Yeah, it's super satirical. It's super just like old fashioned chipper style, and just like, yo, what?
Yeah. So this is the way that I kind of think about it. Like I love to think about this as like the post-credit scene where it's like I imagine there just being all these different singers in the patient's room on Famous Last Words where you get him having going through this huge existential moment and you just have this whole like, you know, Disney scene kind of type beat and it's just like this really powerful ending. And then the nurse walks out, walks into the room next door, and then you have this just mentally insane person singing this song. And it's just like the dichotomy of it, where it's just like you have this like super emotional story, and you just have this dude like, yeah, like these dudes like me because I'm not right in the head. These dudes love to have me here. They're trying to just kind of keep me around because like I don't know how to control myself and it's just a freaking great time. And I love that. I think it's just the funniest way to end this album. And it ends the album on a humorous note for me, which I really like considering how sad this album was as a whole, where you get this you end on this hopeful yet sort of melancholy note of Famous Last Words. But then you get this comedy gold track that is Blood. I just
Yeah, I'm
freaking
just
love it,
like,
man.
yo, we're drinking blood. Is he like making a commentary on how like hospitals profit off of dying people? Is there something deep, or is it just purely like? So I'm just
Yeah.
sitting there, you know.
Yeah, it's a banger track. This is one where I feel like the clean version of this album and the clean version of this song actually adds to the effect of it.
Oh yeah, where
Um
it's just like,
where it's like he leads up into something that's very going clearly going to rhyme with the F word, and he says the doctors and the nurses they adore me so, but it's clearly quite alarming because I'm such an awful, and then you just get
this
it cut
this
out with this beep
long
sound,
beep.
and it's just so funny because I picture it being like they're like they're interviewing patients of a hospital and he gets a little bit too ratchet and they have to cut it out, and then it cuts back to him with him just going through the chorus one more time, and I just find that really funny, where it's like it's just way funnier when they bleep it out than when it's just there.
Yeah, yeah. I thought I forgot I was listening to the Clean album until like that came. I'm like, that doesn't seem right. But I mean, it was funny. It was funny.
It certainly exists. Yep. But yeah, so overall, this is like a top 3 album for me. I have like I went through and I thought about, okay, what is my like top 10 favorite albums of all time? And I didn't really consider that this was a top 3 album until I started sitting down and really looking at albums I liked and just how much I liked this one. And it's just so good. Like again, like it's like a really well done rock opera. The narrative is tight enough that if you intently listen to it, you can hear it and you can grab all these different themes and stuff. But it's just loose enough where it's like each track very much stands on its own. Yeah, I freaking love this album.
Yeah, it definitely gets better when you have background. I mean, some of them just slap on their own, but knowing background doesn't hurt.
No,
Um,
for sure. Yeah, it's definitely worth doing your reading up on when you listen to it. Or you could just listen to this episode of the podcast and then go listen to it. And you're going to be like,
honestly.
"Oh, it all makes sense now."
Yeah, I
But
mean,
yeah,
my only other exposure to punk growing up consistently was probably Paramore. Like I've heard every Paramore song without fail. But this is also refreshing to see another side of punk. Um, yeah.
yeah, freaking baller album. So, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We are rapidly approaching the end of the first season, and I'm super excited for just the last episode. We're going to go through all of the albums that we covered in this season, and we're going to rank them from our least favorite to most favorite. Doesn't mean it's a bad album if it's lower on the list, it just means we prefer it less. Um, so yeah, I'm super excited for that. Be sure to check out the social medias, and yeah, be sure to subscribe and slap that like button. And if you haven't already, go watch the link of the day. According to my YouTube analytics, 99.9% of people don't actually watch the link of the day.
That is sad. You're missing out. You're missing out.
The link of the day is the best part of this podcast. Like it doesn't get better from there. Like the link of the day is the comedy gold of this podcast that you're searching for.
Pretty crazy. If you're even listening to this, if you made it this far, that's pretty tough. Until next
Yeah.
time, don't die.
See you later, nerds.